A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Let's take an opportunity today to turn our attention to the development of Christianity in Australia. And you might be led to believe that it's just been a slow building process. You might not even be so familiar with Australia's history, so steeped in Christianity that it has coloured every aspect of our whole nation. So we're going to talk about the development of Christianity in Australia today, and we're going to get to a point where we talk about a period of 5 years where as many as 1,000 churches were established in Australia in just that short space of time. Wonderful to welcome back to 2020 today historian and political strategist Dr. Christopher Reynolds. His outstanding book on Australia's history is called What a Capital Idea, Australia 1770 to 1901. In fact, he's just heard back from King Charles, who gratefully received a copy of his new book. Christopher, a special welcome back to 2020.
Thank you very much.
Certainly a nice privilege to be able to hear from the King, receiving a copy of your book. It'll become, no doubt, part of the royal archives as to what happens in the colonies.
Yes, it's going straight to the pool room, Neil, I have to say that. I'll have to get a special frame for my letter back from the King.
Okay. Hey, we want to get to a point where we understand in Australia's history where the church really began to blossom and take off in a huge way. And that particular time when 1,000 churches were established in just 5 years. But take us back to some foundations here. So many listeners won't be very familiar with our Christian foundations. If you're talking in a nutshell, where would you start here?
Where would I start? You have to start with Philip, Arthur Phillip, and the influences on the 5 men who sat on a Saturday afternoon, I think it was October 19th, in 1786. And they decided that because the French were had their eyes on the Asian Pacific, they wanted to get into the Asian trade, that they needed to respond. And the idea of putting a settlement in Australia was a plan A with a secret plan B that's never been revealed. I'm not going to tell you today either what it was. But nevertheless, these men had to decide on how a colony could be set up. And you stop and you say, well, what were the influences on these men? This is really quite important. One was they were in the Industrial Revolution era. Now, while there was money and wealth and people in carriages and top hats and arts and etc., there were a lot of people that came into the cities that were cast into poverty. And eventually you get the Charles Dickens novels of Oliver Twist and that incredible poverty that they all lived in. So in that context, the law had been written to give people a second chance at life based on Ephesians 4:28. If he is a thief, let him be given labour that he might be transformed from his ways and help others. So here these Christian men thinking about a colony. Now at that point, what was happening? John Wesley was having his Methodist revival. Massive. Millions in America, hundreds of thousands in England were all becoming, evangelical. Really touched by the Spirit in the church, not just attending church, but there was enthusiasm in the church, etc. So this is very important because when these men sit down, they actually discuss, what we're going to do. And I could just hear one of them say, well, we have to ban slavery. I mean, we can't have slavery in our new colony. I mean, Wesley and Wilberforce are going to be most upset with us if we don't ban slavery. And another one said, well, money's the root of all evil. We can't have them have money. We'll give them land and, land and equipment and food, etc. So this Christian influence then makes its way into the letters patent. And there's a particular benevolent little sentence, I suppose, where the king has decided he's not going to be doing a treaty with the natives, of course, and there won't be any invasion. We're using the international law of terra nullius, and, I'll just take it over, of course. But I'm going to make all the natives in this new place, I'm going to make them British subjects, and they're all going to come under my protection, said the king. Now, this is the first place in the world to ban slavery, and that's what was happening. The moment the king said they are all equal under my protection, and I want you to take care of them. You know, he'd listen to me when I tell you I want you to care for the Aborigines. So there's this Christian expression. Now, in the letters patent, there was a section that talked about the position of the Anglican Church. You know, nobody's going to get a job with government unless they're with the Anglicans, of course, the Church of England. And the King or the Prime Minister has put a great cross through it. And in the paragraph he'd written, I think we better have freedom of religion in this new place. And I've put the letters patent in the back of the book so you can see that there was already this progressive movement towards liberalism. Now, I couldn't find anything on Philip's faith as such, but he's only there 2 weeks and he's writing a commission for a supervisor, superintendent, Gidley King, to go off to Norfolk Island. And in that letter, he says, now you make sure that everybody's in church to reading the scriptures every Sunday. And then I found David Collins, who was the young Attorney General. He says that Philip had everybody in services, which were all outside, of course, there every week. And then Philip then writes, if they're not showing up for church, then I'm going to cut your rations. Right? So this is the beginnings of Christian faith in this country.
And you know, Christopher, those sorts of beginnings, sometimes they slip through the cracks and we don't understand them. You've got a wonderful way of articulating those things, and the accents actually make it entertaining. But you had the likes of Richard Johnson, who was the first chaplain, and he became in charge of law and order even in the early colony. Then Samuel Marsden, it follows on. And I'm just taking us through because we want to get to a point where we're just in a nutshell, these things today, when we talk about when the church began to expand, because there's those early Christian roots and the establishment of the fact that all those convicts need to go to church. But under the Macquaries, they're the ones that really began to say this needs to expand.
Now, you're jumping ahead a bit, but I'll try to keep a sentence or two on just this topic. When Philip decides that his shoulder hurts and he wants to go home, he's had enough because that the war started and the convicts are not being sent out under his care anymore. He goes home. And then a fellow by the name of Gross, who must be a colonel or something, he's not even that, I think, takes over. And the colony becomes worse than any pirate settlement in the Caribbean. The rum, and it got it all going, you know. Pirates had probably moved to Sydney. It was that bad. Well, it gets to the point that the British, after King and Hunter, send out Captain Bligh to be governor. And the Queen actually said at the time, you know, you are the toughest man that we've ever had in the British Navy, and I have just the place for you. And she sends him out. I think it was Victoria, and he arrives and he says, never in the history of mankind has such a debauched and degenerate group of people ever been gathered together as Sydney. It was that bad. So the Tories and people who don't like his attitudes have a rebellion, mutiny. They lock him up, put him on a boat, and they take over. The convicts take over the colony. And it's in this context that in England, they decide it's about time we just cleaned out this lot, sent them all home, and they send Lachlan Macquarie. And this starts a new phase for Australia as well as the church.
So a cleaning up of the debauched city of Sydney.
Yeah.
And then the Macquaries, both Lachlan and his wife, Mrs. Macquarie, listeners will know Mrs. Macquarie's chair, and the name Macquarie just appears all over the nation. Just such wonderful people for the expansion of Christianity.
Yeah, I need to explain something. There's a bit of a gap in why this man who's been in the military for 20-something years. He's Presbyterian, but nothing is ever mentioned about his faith, etc. And so he's a military fellow. He's come out. It's a new job, etc. He's come out with the 73rd Regiment from India. Why does this man, me says to myself as I sit in front of this, why does he become involved in developing Australia? And I got the answer. It's recorded that he went to dinner with a guy called Simon Lord. And Simon sat down to dinner with several others. Now, even Wikipedia will tell you that he had this dinner and all the pastoralists got all upset because what's he doing with this emancipist? Now, in this dinner, I got the names, the people, the night that they had dinner. They say to him afterwards, after dinner, they're sitting having a port or whatever they're drinking and smoking away. They say to him, it's prosperity, Lachlan, is the way we need to go. Good Presbyterian concept of, the world, etc. And he says, what? And they said, there's a new book, it wasn't too new, written by another Scot by the name of Adam Smith. And Adam Smith, writing out of Edinburgh, has come up with this whole new idea of economics and supply and demand. And what we're saying is that someone who's a pastoralist has a bale of wool and it's worth, let's make a figure up, £100. But the time it's loaded on the boats and everybody has got something, it's unloaded, it's stored, etc., it sells for £400. So where was the economy in all of that? It wasn't in just shearing the sheep. It was in the industry that developed. So he looks at them and says, well, what are you suggesting? If you get involved, and how can I help, he says, well, if you develop the social system, the social supports, and the infrastructure, we'll go about developing the industry. So it wasn't just a time where Lachlan Macquarie had 200 churches and buildings put up with his friend Francis Greenway. It wasn't just that. It was the whole business of seeing the value of family, of the value of church. He was right in church. And he and Francis actually sat down and drew up the plans for St Andrew's Cathedral, Sydney, as well as even thinking about a Sydney Harbour Bridge. And here they were thinking about, they had a vision of where they could go. And that was the beginning of Lachlan Macquarie.
And Lachlan Macquarie and his wife Elizabeth founded too the Bible Society. And that continues on in good work right to this present day. So the Macquaries and the expansion of churches, you say under Lachlan Macquarie, 200 churches
and buildings,
established.
Yeah.
Where does that take us to? As we're talking about the development of Christianity in Australia, what's the next phase?
Okay. Now, in England itself, they're in the shadow of the Second Great Awakening in America. Now, the First Great Awakening was John Wesley himself and Charles, hundreds of thousands of people becoming Christian, if not millions. The Second Great Awakening is another incredible story of people praying for 2 years and, finally this group of prayer warriors, and they had a phenomenal story to read. And I don't know what church it was. I'll go for a congregation because I can't think of anything else. And this minister has a couple of friends who are Methodists that come along to visit. Oh, why don't you share the pulpit with me, he says. Well, anyway, there's 4 ministers on the platform, and the first fella gets up and he preaches himself into a fit, and he basically has the rest. And the Methodist says, well, it's my turn, and jumps up into the pulpit. Well, the whole room gets touched by the Spirit. And they thought, this went well, we'll have another meeting in a month. And some phenomenal number, like 5,000 people, show up for this church meeting in the month's time. And so began the Second Great Awakening. Now, this also affects England. Now, this is in 1803, so you've got this phase going on with religion. Now, here comes the point. The Church of England and those who actually believe in the structure are not happy with Macquarie and the way he's treating the emancipists as equals, that they're allowed to do this, and he's having dinner with them and all the rest of it, and he's got all these people building things. So it's a reactionary movement under a fellow by the name of Lord Bathurst. And Bathurst, secretly, against the Prime Minister's will, sets up a commission as the Secretary of State for Wars in the Colony, and then he quietly appoints a commissioner and puts him on a ship to come out and fix Macquarie, and he's told what to do before he even gets on the boat. Don't get good answers, we just want bad ones, I want a bad report. And he's already found a puppet in a general by the name of Brisbane, and Brisbane's going to be sent out to do what he's told. Now, what actually happens in that phase when Brisbane replaces Macquarie, and Brisbane has no concern about the country whatsoever. He's an astronomer, and he wants to just stare at the stars and map the skies. And he only goes to work 1 day a week. That's how much he doesn't care about. So he only lasts a few years. And Darling comes along. But it's a phase in as much as you've got the reactionaries wanting to protect the Anglican Church. Things have structure and we've got to follow order. And you can't have emancipists being treated freely and fairly, etc. The last thing that happened for Macquarie, and this is important, as he was dying, William Wentworth and his wife Elizabeth were at his bedside in England, and he died because he had digestive problems, when the truth is known. He'd been sick for some time. But William announces to Macquarie, the Parliament is just passing a law to allow emancipists, those that have been in prison, to be free and accepted back into society. And that was one of the great things that Macquarie had actually achieved that marks Australia. So there's the phase. Now, when Bathurst finishes in 1828, a new fellow, Ripton, takes over the job. And now it all then culminates in another fellow by Edward Wakefield, and this changes what happens for Burke.
Let's talk Wakefield for a few moments, because he plays such an important role, because he's setting in place legislation that prepares the opportunity for the expansion of the church in Australia in ways that we've never really even imagined.
Yeah. Now, this is a fascinating story with Edward Wakefield. He married. He must have had some position, a bit of money, and but he had 3 children, and his wife died. So he was left with three children, and he decided that the way to make any progress was to marry into aristocracy. He found a young lass, a 16-year-old woman, and he ran her up to Scotland with whatever it is, to play something, wherever they go, and he married the 16-year-old. Well, then he called home and said, "Daddy, I'm home." The Earl of whatever wasn't terribly happy that he'd gone and snatched his daughter and had Wakefield thrown in prison. So while Wakefield's in prison, he writes this letter as though he's living in Sydney. And he writes and sort of talks about how hard it is and how bad it is for the convicts, and says it wasn't working in creating this bad reputation for the whole British Empire, and something needed to be done. So in this letter he says a better idea, instead of having free labour in the convicts being sent out for the pastoralists to make lots of money, why don't we sell the land and give them free transport? So he's out of prison in 29, and a few people are very interested in what he's been writing. And it includes the son of the Prime Minister, Earl Grey, which is Charles Grey, Robert Stuart Mills, Moleston, I think his name is, Molesworth, who becomes important, and a couple of others. And they form a committee. But Charles Grey is the Undersecretary to the new Secretary of State for the Wars and Colonies, on from Bathurst. And his name is Ripon. And he's very impressed with this whole new idea of free passage to get people and families. You can actually then decide who's going to go, and you get the right mix going to Australia. And they have to buy land. Land will be really cheap at $1 an acre. Gee, I wish it was $1 an acre now. £1 an acre.
We all. So
he starts this. Well, it's just phenomenal. Within so many years, they've made £100,000, $14 or $13 million, and the colony finally is able to support itself on the selling of land. So he writes the Constitution. He goes on, but he works for the New Zealand. He writes the New Zealand Constitution for the New Zealand Agricultural Company, the Australian Agricultural Company. He sets up the whole business to do with Adelaide. And he also gets involved with Canada and sorts out the amalgamation of Canada. So he's a phenomenal Australian, if that's what. But he never came here, and yet he continued to do work to actually change the nature of the country. But it's that legislation that brought so many people to come and move into Australia.
It's the legislation that allows this huge expansion of churches, and we're going to come to that in just a few minutes. We'll have to wait a little bit here to get where we're talking today, where 1,000 churches were established in the period of just 5 years. Money was given to churches, and when you drive through country towns, You can see churches, one on each corner, oftentimes right in the centre of towns. We're getting to that point. We're going to return to our conversation very shortly. Our special guest is Dr. Christopher Reynolds. His outstanding book on Australia's history is called What a Capital Idea, Australia 1770 to 1901. We're back with more in just a short while.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.